And coronavirus fears meant major celebrations were called off as Hong Kong rang in the new year. But that didn't stop Hong Kongers from trying to have some fun as they bade farewell to a COVID-riddled 2020.
Happy New Year!
Along the Tsim Sha Tsui Harbourfront, it was not entirely a muted affair on New Year's Eve. Even though there was no laser light and fireworks spectacle to illuminate our skyline for the second year in a row, many Hong Kongers filled the promenade, braving the crowds, cold, and COVID. That's despite a heavy police presence and most parts of the waterfront cordoned off. And that's all for this very moment. To send off a year like 2020. Most people's New Year's wish was to have the pandemic over as soon as possible. Staying healthy was also a top New Year's resolution. Bereft of fireworks along the harbourfront, some chose to welcome the new year in Mong Kok. And with no overnight train services this year, most returned home early after the countdown. Across the harbour, the central waterfront drew a much smaller crowd. As the eerily deserted nightlife hotspot Lan Kwai Fong, which used to bustle with bar-goers, resembled a ghost town. In Causeway Bay, the midnight gun ceremony continued a New Year's tradition dating back to 1946. And for those who chose to count down the new year in the safety and comfort of their home, the Hong Kong Tourism Board for the first time organized a special show to mark the occasion. In New Year's celebrations overseas, a year like no other was celebrated and ushered in like never before. Peter Gavils takes us on a global tour to see how people bid farewell to a year they'd prefer to forget.
New Zealand was one of the first places to say goodbye to 2020. The country has had a strong response to the pandemic, and celebrations were as close to normal as possible.
This is awesome. New Zealand's the only place that's actually having a great time.
Very few masks were worn. Others chose not to wear much clothing at all. Australia also ushered in 2021 with its traditional display in Sydney Harbour. This year's show was shortened to a few minutes and gatherings limited to stop the spread of COVID-19. In past years, 1 million people crowded Sydney's harbour to watch fireworks. London's Big Ben chimed at midnight, ushering in 2021. The mood, however, was not celebratory, with cheering crowds being encouraged to leave. The official fireworks ceremony, which usually takes place, was cancelled to discourage crowds. That tended to be the theme of the night. Similar decisions were taken in major cities across Europe. France flooded the streets with 100,000 law enforcement officers to enforce the nationwide curfew. Only a handful of invited guests, including healthcare workers and others from the front lines of the coronavirus pandemic, gathered